DK tank is something I shunned for a long time. After spending the majority of Wrath of the Lich King Classic in Frost Presence, I can safely say that it's become my favorite tank. The current iteration of the class is not hard by any means, but truly understanding the balancing act of optimizing threat with the incredible self-sustain is what separates the men from the boys. In this video, we'll be going over some of the base aspects of the class where people usually go wrong. I will also touch on some of the parsing tips as we head towards a 30% buff where survivability is less and less important. This guide is made assuming you have a base level understanding of the game, and will gloss over explanations of incredibly basic information. Like most tanks, the priority is to get crit capped, then prioritize stamina, hit to 8%, expertise to 26%, bonus armor, parry, dodge, then strength. Due to the way Death Strike scales with health and stamina being the most efficient way to get a higher effective HP pool means that it takes priority over all. Thus, pay no attention to socket bonuses except for the red gem needed to activate your meta gem. Exception being of course if your hit chance is incredibly low, but with the amount of hit gear we currently have in ICC, it's rare that you'll ever have below 8% hit. Currently, Halion in Ruby Sanctum is the biggest tank buster in the game, and he does parry haste. Therefore, it's very much worth to take a look at gearing for expertise all the way up to 40. Unless you'd like to keep a Frost off-spec to use during trash, there's only really 3 talent setups worth looking at. This is a spec you'll always keep on hand, as it brings both the 10% attack buff as well as the 20% melee haste buff. It barely sacrifices any defensive capabilities and thus is the clear choice for majority of the content, especially in 10-man scenarios. This spec is the beefiest spec you can run. It skips out on taking the 20% melee haste buff in favor of more defense. This should only really be utilized in 25-man content where the haste buff is already brought by a Frost DK or Enchant Shaman. This spec all but guarantees 99s on every single fight. It sacrifices some survivability both through the lack of rune tap and the avoidance talent in the Frost tree for pure and utter damage. It goes 18 points into the Unholy tree and picks up every modifier in the Blood tree for hard strike. With this setup, you'll change your usual rotation and hardly cast any ice touches unless absolutely needed. In the first 2 builds, you'll run Glyph of the Seas, Glyph of Empiric Blood, and Glyph of Runestrike for all content in the game. In the Parse build, you'll run Glyph of the Seas, Glyph of Dancing Rune Weapon, and Glyph of Runestrike. This is where the Death Knight becomes interesting. It's a balancing act of making sure you're maintaining a solid threat lead with icy touches and using death strikes to sustain yourself while creating death runes. Your opener will almost always look like this for threat. 10 seconds before the fight, you use 2 Blood Boils. 3 seconds before the fight, you use Horn of Winter to refresh Blade Barrier. Then Icy Touch, Plague Strike, Death Strike, Rune Tap, Icy Touch, Blood Strike to refresh Blade Barrier, and Powered Rune Weapon. Icy Touch, Icy Touch, Icy Touch, Death Strike, Pestilence. Icy Touch, Icy Touch, Icy Touch, Death Strike, Blood Strike. At this point, it's just about rotating 2 Icy Touches and 1 Death Strike while maintaining debuffs on the target through Pestilence, but also to keep your Blood Runes on cooldown to maintain the Blood Barrier buff. Keep in mind though that in an ideal world you don't want to use both Blood Runes in quick succession, as having a Blood Rune up in order to heal with Rune Tap or to pop Empiric Blood is incredibly important. Your Rune Strike ability should be macroed into every ability and be used as soon as you parry an attack. With the current rate we're getting runic power and the slow melee hits from bosses, there's never really a real scenario where you need to pop Icebound Fortitude and be runic starved at the same time. Further, despite what people may say, it's fine to use death coils. We're unable to dump our runic power fast enough just through the use of Rune Strike with the boss's slow melee swing timers. So if you're above 60 runic power and all your runes are on cooldown, which happens quite often, go ahead and weave some death coils. Once you have a solid threat lead, it's okay to stop spamming icy touches and to use your 4 death runes on just sustaining yourself with death strikes. At this point, it's key to pay attention to your HP bar and to only use death strikes after taking damage. It's absolutely okay to just sit with all runes off cooldown and to save them for when you're taking damage. The parsing rotation is rather straightforward. Maintain buffs, prioritize hard strikes, use death strikes to convert frost and unholy runes into death runes, spam more heart strikes. Keep rune strike macroed into every ability and weave in death coils when all runes are on cooldown. Like all classes, you'll want to run engineering. Second profession at this point in the expansion is much more flexible. Enchanting and mining will do, with jewel crafting and blacksmithing offering the most benefit and flexibility. Your best in slot will look something like this. Everyone and their grandmother will have Shadowmoor at some point, and when that time comes, make sure to swap your tier licks for the added expertise. When it comes to sigils, I think Sigil of the Bone Griffin that you buy from Emblems of Frost is absolute bait. It can be decent on some fights, but on fights like Lich King, where you have so much downtime, it really drops off in value. Running Sigil of Virulence gives you pretty much 100% uptime of 200 strength, which is much higher value in my opinion. If you're progressing, run Rune of Stone Skin and Gargoyle for weapon enchant. But if you have content on farm, you can swap over to Rune of the Fallen Crusader, assuming you're still defense capped. And if you want to parse, you can also run the 2 set of the DPS tier to get 7% extra damage on your hard strikes. Macro-wise, there are few but very important ones to utilize. Make sure to make several macros with your core abilities that also make you cast Rune Strike. Second, make sure to have macros for your Unholy Frenzy. There's either this mouse over macro or this target macro if you have a favorite feral druid in your guild. A tip when it comes to Unholy Frenzy, it does not stack with Death Wish of Fury Warriors. So if you plan to cast it on a warrior for whatever reason, make sure he hasn't already popped Death Wish. Another macro that can be quite useful is a mouse over Death Grip like this. Track and make use of external cooldowns. Making sure you have weak auras or raid tools that track your raid cooldowns are imperative to your success. And make sure to call your fellow raiders out by name before asking for a cooldown. There's nothing worse than a tank saying pain suppression me when there's 2 disc priests in the raid. There's much more I could go over, like how to rotate cooldowns on fights like Lich King and Halion, and much more. But in order to keep things nice and short, we'll end it here. Let me know if there are more topics you'd like to go over in the future, but for now, thank you very much for watching. Until next time.